Carl Jung. Why rejection was never meant to break you, only to guide you. There's a truth about rejection that Carl Jung discovered in his most private writings, a truth so powerful and so contrary to everything society has taught you that it was deliberately buried by mainstream psychology for over a century. Today, I'm going to share this forbidden knowledge with you, and by the end of this journey, you'll never experience rejection the same way again. Jung once wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But what he discovered about rejection went far deeper than this famous quote. In his personal journals, never meant for publication, Jung revealed that rejection is not the cruel punishment we've been conditioned to believe it is. It's not evidence of our unworthiness, our inadequacy, or our failure as human beings. No, rejection is something far more mysterious and profound. It's your unconscious mind's navigation system, guiding you away from paths that would ultimately destroy your authentic self and steering you toward the life you're actually meant to live. Every rejection you've ever experienced contains within it a hidden gift, a piece of guidance from the deepest parts of your psyche that knows things your conscious mind cannot yet understand. But here's why this truth was buried. It threatens the very foundation of our compliance-based society. If people understood that rejection was actually their psyche's way of protecting them from wrong paths, they would stop desperately seeking approval from systems, relationships, and careers that are fundamentally incompatible with their authentic nature. They would stop being controllable through the fear of social exile. They would start living according to their own inner compass, rather than external validation. The pharmaceutical industry, the self-help industrial complex, even traditional psychology, they all profit from your belief that rejection is a wound to be healed, a trauma to be medicated, a problem to be solved. But Jung saw it differently. He saw rejection as the psyche's fierce guardian, protecting the soul from contamination by forces that would diminish its authentic power. Let me tell you the story that led Jung to this revolutionary understanding. In 1913, at the height of his career and international recognition, Jung published ideas that were so controversial, so challenging to the psychological establishment, that he was systematically rejected by his peers. His mentor Freud turned against him. The International Psychoanalytic Association expelled him. Colleagues who had once celebrated his brilliance now treated him as if he were mentally unstable. For most people, this level of professional and personal rejection would have been devastating. It would have sent them scrambling back to conformity, desperate to regain acceptance. But Jung did something extraordinary instead. He listened to what the rejection was, telling him he saw it not as punishment but as confirmation that he was on the path toward a truth too radical for the collective consciousness of his time to accept. That rejection led him deeper into his own psyche, into what he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious. It forced him to develop entirely new ways of understanding human psychology, concepts of the shadow, the anima and animus, the collective unconscious, an individuation that would revolutionize our understanding of human development. The very ideas that got him rejected became his greatest contributions to humanity. Jung realized that rejection had saved him from a life of intellectual mediocrity. If he had remained accepted by the psychoanalytic establishment, he would have spent his career elaborating on Freud's theories instead of discovering the profound truths about human consciousness that were his authentic gift to the world. The rejection was his psyche's way of saying, "This path is too small for who you're meant to become." This is the secret Jung discovered. Your unconscious mind is far wiser than your conscious mind. It can see the long-term trajectory of your life in ways your rational mind cannot. When you experience rejection, your unconscious is often orchestrating a course correction, steering you away from relationships, careers, or life paths that would ultimately diminish your authentic power and toward the expression of your deepest truth. But society has programmed you to interpret this guidance as punishment. From childhood, you've been conditioned to believe that acceptance equals safety and rejection equals death. This programming serves the collective, not the individual. It keeps you seeking approval from systems that need your compliance more than they need your authenticity. What I'm about to reveal to you over the next 2 hours will completely revolutionize how you understand every rejection you've ever experienced. You'll learn to decode rejection as a form of unconscious intelligence. You'll discover why the people and opportunities that reject you are often doing you the greatest favor of your life. You'll understand how to use rejection as fuel for authentic self-discovery rather than evidence of your inadequacy. But I must warn you, this knowledge comes with responsibility. Once you understand rejection as guidance rather than punishment, you can no longer play the victim. You can no longer blame external circumstances for your life's direction. You'll be called to step into a level of personal responsibility and authentic self-expression that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. The path I'm about to show you is not for everyone. It's for those who are ready to stop seeking acceptance from a world that was never designed to understand them anyway. It's for those brave enough to let rejection guide them toward their authentic calling, even when that calling seems to threaten the very foundations of how they've understood themselves and their place in the world. Jung understood that the most profound psychological growth happens not when we're accepted and comfortable, but when we're rejected and forced to discover who we really are beneath the masks we wear for others. Every rejection is an invitation to go deeper into your authentic self. Every closed door is redirection toward the path you're actually meant to walk. So before we continue this journey together, I want you to ask yourself, are you ready to discover that every rejection you've experienced might have been protecting you from a life that was too small for your authentic power? Are you prepared to see that the pain you've carried from being rejected might actually be misdirected gratitude for having been saved from wrong paths? If you're ready for this level of truth, if you're prepared to see rejection through Jung's revolutionary lens, then let's begin. Because what you're about to discover will not only transform how you understand your past rejections, it will fundamentally change how you move through every relationship, career decision, and life choice from this moment forward. The journey into Jung's forbidden truth about rejection starts now, and it begins with understanding how society weaponized your most fundamental need for belonging to keep you trapped in a prison of external validation. Every human being enters this world with a fundamental need that runs deeper than hunger, deeper than thirst, deeper even than the need for physical safety. It's the need for acceptance, for belonging, for the assurance that we are valued by the tribe. This need is written into our DNA, carved into our nervous system by millions of years of evolution, during which rejection from the group meant certain death. But here's what Jung discovered that changes everything. Modern civilization has taken this ancient survival mechanism and weaponized it against your authentic development. Society has hijacked your biological need for acceptance and turned it into a system of psychological control that keeps you trapped in roles, relationships, and life paths that slowly suffocate your true nature. Let me paint you a picture of how this works. When you were born, you were pure, authentic expression. You cried when you needed something, laughed when you were delighted, expressed anger when you were frustrated. You had no concept of rejection because you had no false self to protect. You simply were. But then the conditioning began. Don't cry, or people won't like you. Be a good boy and everyone will love you. Act like a lady or no one will want to marry you. Study hard and be successful so people will respect you. Piece by piece, your authentic self was taught to hide behind a mask of acceptability. This process isn't malicious. Your parents, teachers, and society believed they were helping you navigate the world successfully. But what they were actually doing was programming your nervous system to interpret rejection as a life-threatening emergency, even when no real danger existed. They were teaching you to equate your worth with external validation, to see rejection as evidence of your fundamental inadequacy, rather than simple incompatibility. The result? You learned to shapeshift. You learned to become whatever you thought others wanted you to be. You developed what Jung called a persona, a mask you wear to gain acceptance. And over time, this mask became so sophisticated, so convincing, that you began to mistake it for your real self. Let me tell you about Marcus, a man who came to understand this programming in the most painful way possible. Marcus was the ultimate people pleaser. He had learned early in childhood that his worth was directly proportional to how much others approved of him. His mother praised him only when he was achieving. His father showed affection only when Marcus made him proud. His teachers rewarded him only when he conformed to their expectations. So Marcus became a chameleon. In business meetings, he was the agreeable team player. With his friends, he was whoever they needed him to be. In relationships, he molded himself to match what he thought his partners wanted. He said yes when he meant no, smiled when he was angry, agreed when he disagreed. He had become a master at avoiding rejection by never showing his authentic self to anyone. But here's the cruel irony that Jung understood. The more desperately you try to avoid rejection, the more you guarantee your own psychological death. Marcus spent so much energy maintaining his acceptable persona that he completely lost touch with who he actually was beneath the mask. He was accepted everywhere and belonged nowhere. He was approved of by everyone and known by no one. The breaking point came when Marcus realized that his wife of 10 years was in love with his persona, not with him. She loved the agreeable, successful, accommodating man he pretended to be. When he tried to show her his authentic feelings, his fears, his anger, his dreams that didn't match her expectations, she became confused and distant. "This isn't like you," she would say, which was exactly the point. She had never met the real him. Marcus's marriage ended in divorce. His business partnerships dissolved when he started setting boundaries, and several of his friendships evaporated when he stopped being the agreeable sidekick they expected. From the outside, it looked like Marcus's life was falling apart. But Jung would have recognized what was really happening. Marcus's authentic self was finally rejecting the life his false self had built. This is the unconscious wound that society has inflicted on all of us. We've been taught to see rejection as the enemy, when rejection is often our authentic self's way of saying, this relationship, this job, this life path, it's not compatible with who you really are. We've been programmed to interpret the ending of incompatible situations as failure, when it's actually our psyche's navigation system guiding us toward compatibility. But the programming runs even deeper than individual relationships. Entire industries profit from your fear of rejection. The fashion industry sells you products to avoid the rejection of being unfashionable. The education system threatens you with the rejection of being unsuccessful if you don't comply with their curriculum. The pharmaceutical industry medicates your authentic emotional responses to rejection instead of helping you understand what your emotions are trying to tell you. Even the self-help industry, which claims to empower you, often just provides more sophisticated strategies for gaining acceptance rather than techniques for expressing authenticity. You're taught to fake it till you make it, to network your way to success, to say the right things, to make people like you. All of this keeps you trapped in the same fundamental delusion that acceptance is more important than authenticity. Jung saw through this entire system. He realized that psychological health doesn't come from being accepted by everyone. It comes from being authentic enough that the right people accept you for who you actually are, while the wrong people naturally reject you and move on. He understood that rejection is often your psyche's way of filtering out incompatible relationships and opportunities to make space for compatible ones. Think about your own life for a moment. I want you to remember your earliest experience of rejection. Maybe it was being excluded from a group of kids at school. Maybe it was not making the team or not getting the part in the school play. Maybe it was having your affection rejected by someone you cared about. Can you feel how that rejection is still alive in your nervous system? Can you sense how it shaped your behavior, how it taught you to hide parts of yourself to avoid experiencing that pain again? That early rejection became a template, a wound around which you organized your entire personality. You learned to reject parts of yourself before others could reject them. But here's what Jung would want you to understand: that early rejection might have been the first time your authentic self tried to express itself in a world that wasn't ready to receive it. The pain you felt wasn't evidence of your inadequacy. It was your soul's recognition that it had been misunderstood. Comment below and tell me, what was your earliest memory of rejection, and how can you see now that it might have been protecting your authentic self from an incompatible situation? The tragedy is that most people never recover from these early rejections. They spend their entire lives building elaborate defense systems to avoid experiencing that pain again. They construct personas so convincing that they fool everyone, including themselves. They become successful at being accepted for who they're not, while remaining completely unknown for who they are. This is what Jung meant when he talked about the persona becoming a prison. The mask you created to avoid rejection becomes the bars that separate you from authentic connection. The strategies you develop to gain acceptance become the very obstacles that prevent you from being truly accepted for who you are. But there's hope, and it lies in understanding that rejection is not your enemy. Rejection is your psyche's guidance system, steering you away from people and situations that require you to betray your authentic nature to gain acceptance. When you understand this, everything changes. Rejection stops being evidence of your inadequacy and starts being evidence of incompatibility. The person who rejects your authentic expression is doing you a favor by revealing that they're not capable of appreciating who you really are. The job that doesn't hire you because you refuse to pretend to be someone you're not is protecting you from a career that would slowly kill your soul. The friend group that excludes you when you stop playing the role they assigned to you is making space in your life for people who can actually handle your authenticity. This is the first step in Jung's revolutionary understanding of rejection, recognizing that society has programmed you to fear the very thing that could set you free. Your authentic self has been trying to guide you all along, but you've been trained to ignore its wisdom in favor of external validation. But before we can fully embrace rejection as guidance, we need to understand the elaborate prison we've built to avoid it. We need to examine the persona, the mask that promises safety but delivers psychological suffocation. Because until you understand how your fear of rejection created a false self, you can't appreciate how rejection might be trying to liberate your true self. The persona, Jung wrote, is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society, fittingly enough a kind of mask, designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other, to conceal the true nature of the individual. But what Jung discovered about the persona was far more sinister than he initially revealed. The mask you create to avoid rejection doesn't just hide your authentic self. It eventually becomes a prison that holds your soul hostage. Let me tell you about Emma, a woman who built the perfect persona, and nearly lost herself in the process. Emma grew up in a family where love was conditional on performance. She learned early that being the good daughter meant being agreeable, successful, and never causing any trouble. She got straight A's, never talked back, always helped with household duties, and made her parents proud at every school function. This strategy worked beautifully until it didn't. Emma became so skilled at being the perfect daughter that she forgot she had any other options. She chose a career in law, not because she loved it, but because her parents respected lawyers. She married a man not because he understood her soul, but because her family approved of him. She had children not because she felt called to motherhood, but because that's what good daughters from good families did. By the age of 35, Emma had achieved everything society told her would make her happy. She had a successful career, a stable marriage, 2 well-behaved children, and a beautiful home in a prestigious neighborhood. From the outside, her life looked perfect, but inside, Emma felt like she was suffocating. The breaking point came during what should have been a celebration. Emma had just made partner at her law firm, and her family threw her a congratulatory dinner. As she sat at the table listening to toasts about her success, she felt like she was watching someone else's life. The woman they were celebrating, the successful lawyer, the devoted wife, the perfect mother, felt like a stranger to her. That night, Emma did something that shocked her family and terrified her. She told them she was thinking about leaving law to become an artist. The reaction was swift and brutal. Her father called it a midlife crisis. Her mother accused her of being selfish and ungrateful. Her husband threatened to reconsider their marriage if she walked away from her stable income. Even her children seemed confused and disappointed in her. For the first time in her life, Emma experienced the full force of her family's rejection. But something unexpected happened. Instead of devastating her, their rejection began to feel like liberation. She realized that their love had always been conditional on her maintaining the persona they found acceptable. They weren't rejecting her authentic self. They were rejecting the loss of their familiar, controllable version of her. Emma's story illustrates one of Jung's most profound insights. The persona starts as a survival strategy but ends as a psychological prison. You create a mask to protect yourself from rejection, but over time the mask begins to suffocate the very self it was meant to protect. You become so identified with your persona that you forget it's not who you actually are. The insidious thing about the persona prison is that it's invisible to the person trapped inside it. You think you're being authentic when you're actually performing a role you've been rehearsing for so long that it feels natural. You believe you're making choices when you're actually following a script written by your fear of rejection. Think about your own persona for a moment. Who do you become in professional settings? How do you modify your personality around certain family members? What parts of yourself do you hide when you're trying to make a good impression? These modifications aren't necessarily wrong. Social intelligence requires some adaptation to different contexts. But when these adaptations become so pervasive that you lose touch with your authentic preferences, feelings, and desires, the persona has become a prison. Jung identified several warning signs that your persona has taken over your life. First, you find yourself saying yes to things you don't actually want to do. Second, you struggle to identify your authentic preferences when no one else's expectations are involved. Third, you feel exhausted from maintaining different versions of yourself for different people. Fourth, you experience anxiety when you consider expressing thoughts or feelings that might be rejected. Fifth, you feel like people love and accept a version of you that isn't entirely real. The most tragic aspect of persona imprisonment is that it prevents authentic connection. When you're always performing acceptability, you never get to experience the profound intimacy that comes from being truly seen and accepted for who you are. Your relationships become transactions based on role fulfillment rather than genuine appreciation for your authentic self. But here's where Jung's understanding of rejection becomes revolutionary. The rejection you fear most is often exactly what your authentic self needs to break free from the persona prison. Emma's family's rejection of her artistic dreams wasn't evidence that she was making a mistake. It was evidence that she was finally making a choice based on her authentic desires rather than their expectations. The persona creates a cruel paradox. The more successfully you avoid rejection by maintaining your mask, the more you guarantee that your authentic self will remain unknown and unloved. You achieve acceptance at the cost of intimacy. You gain approval at the expense of authenticity. You avoid the pain of rejection, but also miss the joy of genuine connection. Jung understood that psychological development requires what he called persona breakdown, moments when the mask cracks and the authentic self begins to emerge. These breakdowns often feel like personal crises because they're accompanied by rejection from people who preferred your masked version. But what feels like breakdown is actually breakthrough. Consider the personas that dominate our culture. The successful entrepreneur who's never allowed to show vulnerability. The strong mother who's never permitted to have needs of her own. The rational man who's forbidden from expressing emotional depth. The good woman who's expected to prioritize everyone else's needs above her own. These personas promise acceptance, but they deliver psychological suffocation. The persona prison is reinforced by a society that rewards conformity and punishes authenticity. You're taught to see rejection as failure rather than incompatibility. You're encouraged to adapt yourself, to fit into existing systems rather than finding or creating systems that appreciate your authentic nature. You're trained to see persona maintenance as maturity rather than recognizing it as a form of self-betrayal. But Jung saw through this entire system. He recognized that authentic psychological development requires the courage to face rejection, not because you're seeking rejection, but because authentic expression will naturally be incompatible with people and systems that require your inauthenticity to function. Let me share a moment of personal vulnerability here. For years, I maintained a persona of having my life completely figured out. I presented myself as someone who had transcended ordinary human struggles, who had found the answers that everyone else was seeking. This persona served me well in many contexts. It made me appear credible, confident, and worthy of respect. But it also created a barrier between me and genuine connection. People approached me as if I were some kind of guru, someone who was beyond ordinary human struggles. They shared their vulnerabilities with me, but I rarely shared mine with them. I was accepted for being wise and together, but I was lonely for being understood as human and flawed. The breakdown of this persona came through rejection. When I began sharing my own struggles, confusions, and uncertainties, some people were disappointed. They had preferred the idealized version of me that seemed to have transcended human limitations. Their rejection stung, but it also freed me to connect more authentically with people who could appreciate the full spectrum of my humanity. This is the paradox Jung understood. The rejection of your persona is often the liberation of your authentic self. The people who reject your authenticity are revealing that they were never capable of loving the real you anyway. Their rejection isn't evidence of your inadequacy. It's evidence of their limitation. But escaping the persona prison requires more than just understanding its existence. It requires the development of what Jung called persona consciousness, the ability to wear your mask deliberately rather than unconsciously. You need to know when you're adapting to a situation and when you're betraying your authentic nature. You need to distinguish between healthy social flexibility and unhealthy self-abandonment. The goal isn't to eliminate the persona entirely. That would be social and professional suicide. The goal is to develop a conscious relationship with your persona, to use it as a tool rather than being used by it. You want to be able to put on appropriate social masks when necessary, while never forgetting who you really are underneath them. This requires what Jung called shadow integration, embracing the parts of yourself that you've hidden to maintain acceptability. It requires recognizing that your fear of rejection has caused you to reject parts of yourself. Every aspect of your personality that you've hidden to avoid judgment is a piece of your authentic self that's been exiled to maintain your persona. Emma's journey out of the persona prison required her to face not just her family's rejection, but her own terror of being seen as selfish, irresponsible, or inadequate. She had to reclaim the parts of herself, her creativity, her spontaneity, her right to prioritize her own fulfillment that she had sacrificed to maintain her good daughter persona. The process was terrifying but ultimately liberating. As Emma began to express her authentic self more fully, she experienced more rejection from people who preferred her masked version. But she also began to attract people who appreciated her authenticity. She discovered that being rejected for who she really was felt infinitely better than being accepted for who she wasn't. Comment below. Can you identify a persona that you've been maintaining? What parts of yourself have you hidden to gain acceptance? What would it look like to express those hidden aspects more authentically? This is the profound truth Jung discovered about rejection and persona. The very rejection you've been avoiding by maintaining your mask is often exactly what your authentic self needs to break free. Your persona isn't protecting you from rejection. It's protecting you from the kind of rejection that would actually liberate you from incompatible relationships and situations. But before you can fully embrace this liberation, we need to understand another crucial aspect of Jung's teaching: how your fear of rejection causes you to reject others first, and how this rejection pattern reveals the hidden aspects of your own psyche. This is where we enter the territory of shadow projection, where what you're really rejecting in others becomes the key to understanding what you've been rejecting in yourself. Jung made a discovery that would revolutionize how we understand human judgment. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But the full implications of this insight are far more profound and disturbing than most people realize. Your fear of rejection doesn't just cause you to hide parts of yourself. It causes you to project and reject those same hidden parts when you see them in others. What you judge most harshly in other people is almost always what you've been forced to reject in yourself. This mechanism, which Jung called shadow projection, creates a vicious cycle. You reject aspects of yourself to avoid social rejection. Then, when you encounter those same aspects in others, you reflexively reject them as well, both to maintain your persona and to avoid confronting what you've disowned in yourself. This projection serves as a psychological defense mechanism, but it also reveals the exact blueprint of your own suppressed authenticity. Let me tell you about David, a man whose pattern of judging others became the key to unlocking his own psychological prison. David prided himself on being rational, controlled, and professionally successful. He had built his career in finance through discipline, logical analysis, and emotional restraint. His persona was that of the competent, reliable man who never let feelings interfere with good judgment. But David had a problem. He felt an intense irritation, almost rage, whenever he encountered people he considered too emotional or dramatic. He would dismiss colleagues who became passionate in meetings as unprofessional. He would reject romantic partners who wanted to discuss feelings as needy or high maintenance. He would judge friends who made decisions based on intuition rather than logic as irresponsible. What David didn't understand was that his judgments were a mirror, reflecting his own disowned emotional nature. As a child, David had learned that expressing strong emotions led to rejection from his stoic father and anxious mother. He had internalized the message that feelings were weakness, that success required emotional suppression, that being loved meant being rational and controlled. So David had exiled his emotional self to his shadow, the part of his psyche that contains all the aspects of himself he couldn't accept. But exiling something doesn't make it disappear, it just makes it unconscious. David's suppressed emotional nature didn't vanish. It went underground, where it began to influence his behavior in ways he couldn't recognize. The breakthrough came during a corporate retreat, when David found himself in intense conflict with a colleague named Sarah. Sarah was everything David claimed to dislike in people. She was passionate, intuitive, emotionally expressive, and willing to let personal values influence business decisions. During a team-building exercise, their conflict escalated into a heated argument that shocked everyone, including David himself. Later, when David was reflecting on why Sarah triggered him so intensely, he began to notice something disturbing. Every quality he criticized in Sarah was something he had once possessed, but had learned to suppress. As a child, David had been emotionally expressive, intuitive, passionate about his interests, but those qualities had been systematically rejected by his family and educational environment until he learned to hide them completely. Sarah wasn't triggering his anger because she was wrong. She was triggering his anger because she was expressing aspects of himself that he had been forced to reject. His judgment of her was actually his judgment of his own disowned emotional nature. His criticism of her unprofessionalism was actually his fear that if he expressed similar authenticity, he too would be rejected and judged inadequate. This is the hidden mechanism of shadow projection that Jung discovered. We reject in others what we've been conditioned to reject in ourselves. Our harshest judgments reveal our deepest wounds. The qualities that trigger our strongest negative reactions are usually the very qualities we've had to suppress to maintain our acceptable persona. But Jung's insight goes even deeper. He realized that our projections don't just reveal what we've rejected in ourselves. They reveal what wants to be integrated back into our conscious awareness. David's intense reaction to Sarah wasn't just about past wounds. It was his psyche's way of saying, "Pay attention to this. There's something here you need to reclaim." The shadow contains not just our negative traits, but also our positive potentials that we've disowned because they seemed incompatible with acceptance. David had rejected not just his emotional weakness, but also his emotional intelligence, his creative intuition, his capacity for passionate engagement with his values. In judging Sarah, he was unconsciously recognizing qualities he needed to develop in himself. This is one of the most transformative aspects of Jung's teaching about rejection and projection. The people who irritate you most are often your greatest teachers. They're showing you, through your own reaction, what aspects of yourself you've hidden in service of maintaining an acceptable persona. Your strongest judgments are roadmaps to your own psychological wholeness. Think about this in your own life. Who are the people that trigger your strongest negative reactions? What qualities in others do you find most intolerable? I want you to consider the possibility that these people aren't triggering you because they're wrong or bad, but because they're expressing aspects of yourself that you've been conditioned to reject. Maybe you judge people who are too selfish because you've never learned to prioritize your own needs. Maybe you criticize people who are too sensitive because you've had to armor yourself against emotional pain. Maybe you dismiss people who are too ambitious because you've been taught that wanting success makes you greedy. Maybe you reject people who are too spiritual because you've had to suppress your own longing for meaning and transcendence. Each judgment reveals a piece of your shadow, a part of yourself that was exiled to maintain acceptability, but that your psyche is trying to reintegrate. The more intense your reaction to someone else's behavior, the more likely it is that you're seeing a disowned aspect of yourself reflected back to you. But here's where this understanding becomes truly revolutionary. Once you recognize your projections, you can begin to use other people's rejection of you as information about their shadow, rather than evidence of your inadequacy. When someone judges or rejects your authentic expression, you can ask yourself, what might this person have had to reject in themselves to maintain their current persona? This doesn't mean excusing harmful behavior or avoiding accountability. It means understanding that rejection often says more about the person doing the rejecting than about the person being rejected. Someone who judges your emotional expression might be defending against their own suppressed feelings. Someone who criticizes your ambition might be protecting themselves from acknowledging their own unrealized dreams. Someone who rejects your authenticity might be afraid of confronting their own inauthenticity. Jung called this taking back your projections, recognizing that your judgments of others are really information about your own psychological development. Instead of using your reactions to justify avoiding certain types of people, you can use them as a curriculum for inner work. Every person who triggers you becomes a teacher showing you what aspects of yourself need integration. Let me share how this played out in my own life. For years, I was highly critical of people I saw as performative or attention-seeking. I would judge influencers, public speakers, and anyone who seemed to enjoy being in the spotlight. I told myself that my criticism was about authenticity. These people were shallow, narcissistic, fake. But when I honestly examined my reaction, I realized I was projecting my own shame about wanting attention and recognition. I had learned early that seeking attention was selfish and inappropriate, so I had developed a persona of being humble and self-effacing. But underneath that persona was a natural desire for recognition, appreciation, and influence that I had never allowed myself to acknowledge. My judgment of attention-seeking people was really my judgment of my own disowned ambition and desire for visibility. When I began to integrate this shadow aspect, allowing myself to want recognition and to pursue platforms where my work could have greater impact, my criticism of performative people completely disappeared. I could suddenly see the authentic passion and genuine desire to serve that motivated many people I had previously dismissed. This is the profound gift of understanding shadow projection. It transforms your relationships from battlegrounds of judgment into opportunities for self-discovery. Every person who triggers you becomes a mirror showing you aspects of yourself that are ready to be reclaimed and integrated. But Jung also warned about the dangers of misusing this understanding. Shadow projection work isn't about excusing harmful behavior by claiming it's just my projection. Some behaviors are genuinely problematic and need to be addressed directly. The key is learning to distinguish between projections of your disowned qualities and legitimate responses to actual harmful behavior. The test Jung suggested is this: if your reaction to someone is disproportionately intense compared to their actual behavior, you're probably dealing with a projection. If your judgment of someone is absolute and doesn't allow for any nuance or humanity, you're likely seeing your own shadow. If your criticism of someone feels emotionally charged rather than calmly objective, your shadow is probably involved. This understanding completely revolutionizes how you relate to rejection. Instead of taking every rejection personally, you can ask, what might this person need to reject in themselves that they're also rejecting in me? Instead of assuming that rejection means you're inadequate, you can consider that rejection might mean you're expressing something the other person has had to suppress. This doesn't mean that all rejection is projection. Sometimes rejection is simply incompatibility. But understanding shadow projection gives you a much more sophisticated way to decode rejection experiences. You can distinguish between rejection that's about you and rejection that's about the other person's relationship with disowned aspects of themselves. Comment below. Can you think of a quality in others that triggers strong judgment from you? What might this reveal about an aspect of yourself that you've rejected or suppressed? How might reclaiming this quality serve your authentic development? The shadow projection mechanism also explains why authentic people often experience more rejection than inauthentic people. When you express your full range of human qualities, including those that are typically suppressed or judged, you trigger other people's projections of their own disowned aspects. Your authenticity forces others to confront what they've rejected in themselves, which can be uncomfortable enough to generate rejection. But Jung saw this as a sacred service. By being willing to express your full humanity, including the aspects that society has deemed unacceptable, you give other people permission to integrate their own wholeness. Your willingness to face rejection for being authentic creates space for others to do the same. This is why Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming your authentic self, is not just a personal journey but a collective service. Every person who has the courage to integrate their shadow and express their wholeness makes it easier for others to do the same. Every person who stops projecting their disowned qualities onto others creates more space for authentic relationship. But before you can fully serve this function, you need to understand how rejection operates not just as personal guidance, but as a collective phenomenon. Sometimes the rejection you experience isn't about individual relationships. It's about your consciousness evolving beyond what the collective is ready to accept. This is where we move into understanding rejection as your psyche's guidance system, not just steering you away from wrong relationships, but steering you toward your authentic calling in life. What if I told you that your unconscious mind possesses a form of intelligence so sophisticated that it can see the long-term trajectory of your life in ways your rational mind cannot even imagine? What if every rejection you've ever experienced was actually your psyche's navigation system, steering you away from paths that would ultimately diminish your authentic power and toward the expression of your deepest truth? This is perhaps Jung's most revolutionary insight about rejection. It operates as a guidance system with access to information your conscious mind doesn't possess. Your psyche can perceive the subtle energetic incompatibilities between your authentic nature and certain people, opportunities, or life paths long before your rational mind recognizes the mismatch. Rejection often occurs not because you're inadequate, but because your unconscious wisdom is protecting you from situations that would require you to betray your essential self. Let me tell you the story of Maria, a woman whose series of professional rejections led her to discover her life's true calling. Maria had always dreamed of being a doctor. She excelled in her science courses, volunteered at hospitals, and built her entire identity around the goal of becoming a physician. But when she applied to medical school, she was rejected by every program. The rejection was devastating. Maria felt like her entire life plan had crumbled. She had defined herself by this goal for so long that being rejected felt like being told she was fundamentally inadequate. She spent months in depression, questioning her worth, her intelligence, her entire sense of purpose. But something interesting happened in the aftermath of this rejection. With medical school no longer an option, Maria took a job at a nonprofit organization that provided healthcare education to underserved communities. She assumed it would be temporary, a way to rebuild her medical school applications while gaining relevant experience. Instead, Maria discovered a passion she never knew existed. She found that she was extraordinarily gifted at translating complex medical information into accessible education programs. She had an intuitive understanding of how to reach people who had been marginalized by traditional healthcare systems. She could connect with communities that many medical professionals struggled to serve effectively. Within 2 years, Maria had developed innovative health education programs that were being implemented across multiple states. She had found her authentic calling, not as someone who treated individual patients, but as someone who prevented disease and promoted health literacy on a massive scale. Her work was reaching thousands of people, rather than the limited number she could have served as a traditional physician. Looking back, Maria realized that her rejection from medical school hadn't been punishment. It had been redirection. Her psyche had known something her conscious mind couldn't see, that while she had the intellectual capability to be a doctor, her authentic gifts lay in health education and community outreach. The rejection had steered her away from a career that would have utilized only a small portion of her actual talents toward work that engaged her full potential. This is how Jung understood rejection as guidance. Your unconscious mind can perceive the difference between what you think you want and what would actually fulfill your authentic nature. Sometimes the paths you're most attached to are the ones that would limit your growth rather than facilitate it. Rejection from those paths isn't evidence of inadequacy, it's evidence of protection. The key to understanding rejection as guidance lies in recognizing the intelligence behind the patterns. Maria's rejection from medical school wasn't random, it was consistent. Every program she applied to turned her down, despite her strong qualifications. This consistency suggested that something beyond her conscious understanding was orchestrating these outcomes. Jung believed that the psyche operates according to what he called the transcendent function, a mechanism that synthesizes conscious intentions with unconscious wisdom to guide you toward your authentic development. Sometimes this function manifests as synchronicities that open certain doors while closing others. Sometimes it manifests as intuitive attractions or aversions that steer you toward or away from particular opportunities. And sometimes it manifests as rejection that appears to block your path, but is actually redirecting you toward a better one. Consider the rejection patterns in your own life. Have you noticed certain types of opportunities consistently rejecting you while others seem to open easily? Have you experienced rejections that initially seemed devastating but ultimately led you toward something better? Have you observed that the paths of least resistance in your life often lead to your most authentic expressions? This is your psyche's guidance system in operation. It's not random and it's not punishment. It's an intelligent force that has access to information about your authentic potential that your rational mind hasn't yet discovered. Learning to read this guidance requires developing what Jung called symbolic thinking, the ability to see meaning and pattern in seemingly random events. Let me share another example. James was a talented musician who spent years trying to get signed by record labels. He sent demo tapes, performed at showcases, networked with industry professionals, and consistently faced rejection. For years, he interpreted this rejection as evidence that he wasn't good enough to make it in the music industry. But when James finally gave up on getting signed and started creating music purely for his own fulfillment, something unexpected happened. He began sharing his songs on social media without any commercial agenda. His authentic, uncommercial style attracted a devoted following of people who resonated deeply with his unique artistic voice. Within a year, James had built a sustainable career as an independent musician, making more money and reaching more people. than he ever could have through traditional record label channels. The rejection from labels hadn't been blocking his musical career. It had been protecting him from a system that would have required him to compromise his authentic artistic vision. James realized that his psyche had been guiding him away from a path that would have given him external validation, but required him to betray his artistic authenticity toward a path that allowed him to maintain his artistic integrity while building a sustainable career. The rejections that seemed to be closing doors were actually steering him toward the right door. This is the profound reframe Jung offered: rejection as redirection rather than punishment. Your psyche is constantly steering you away from paths that would require you to diminish your authentic power and toward paths that would allow you to express your full potential. But this guidance often contradicts your conscious desires, which is why it can feel like obstacle rather than assistance. The challenge is learning to distinguish between rejection that's guiding you toward authenticity and rejection that's simply incompatibility or timing. Jung suggested several ways to decode rejection as guidance. First, look for patterns. If you're consistently rejected by certain types of opportunities or relationships, your psyche might be telling you something about compatibility. Random rejections are usually just circumstances, but consistent patterns often indicate guidance. Second, notice your emotional response to rejection. If rejection from something leaves you feeling relieved underneath the initial disappointment, your psyche might have been looking for an exit. If rejection motivates you to become more authentic rather than more accommodating, it's likely serving your development. Third, observe what opens up after rejection closes something down. Often, rejection from one path creates space and energy for a better path to emerge. If you can resist the temptation to immediately seek another version of what was rejected, you might discover what your psyche was trying to guide you toward. Fourth, examine whether the rejection is asking you to change who you are or simply redirecting where you express who you are. Guidance-based rejection usually doesn't require you to become someone different. It asks you to express your authenticity in a different context. The most profound aspect of understanding rejection as guidance is that it requires you to develop trust in an intelligence that operates beyond your conscious understanding. You have to be willing to consider that your psyche might know things about your path that your rational mind hasn't yet grasped. This requires a fundamental shift from trying to control outcomes to learning to collaborate with the deeper wisdom of your unconscious. This doesn't mean becoming passive or fatalistic. It means learning to distinguish between effort that flows from your authentic nature and effort that stems from ego attachment to specific outcomes. When you're aligned with your authentic path, effort feels energizing rather than depleting. Doors tend to open more easily. The right people and opportunities seem to appear synchronistically. When you're forcing a path that's incompatible with your authentic nature, everything feels like an uphill battle. You experience consistent rejection, obstacles, and resistance. You find yourself having to compromise your values or suppress your authentic expression to make progress. These are signals from your guidance system that you might be on the wrong path. Comment below and share. Can you think of a rejection in your life that initially seemed devastating but ultimately led you towards something better? What did that experience teach you about trusting your psyche's guidance? But Jung also warned about the shadow side of interpreting rejection as guidance. This understanding can be misused to avoid taking responsibility for authentic effort, or to justify giving up when things become challenging. The key is learning to distinguish between rejection that's redirecting you toward authenticity and rejection that's simply the natural resistance that accompanies any meaningful growth. True guidance-based rejection doesn't ask you to become less than who you are. It asks you to become more fully who you are in a different context. It doesn't diminish your sense of personal power. It redirects that power toward more authentic expression. It doesn't leave you feeling defeated. It leaves you feeling like you've been saved from something that would have ultimately been unsatisfying. The most sophisticated aspect of Jung's understanding is that rejection as guidance often operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Maria's rejection from medical school guided her away from an incompatible career path and toward her authentic calling, but it also guided her through a necessary psychological development process. The experience of having her identity-defining goal rejected forced her to discover who she was beyond her career aspirations. This is the deeper function of rejection as guidance. It strips away false identifications and attachments that prevent you from accessing your authentic power. When you're overly identified with specific outcomes, particular relationships, careers, achievements, you become psychologically rigid. Rejection breaks up this rigidity and creates space for new possibilities to emerge. Your psyche uses rejection not just to steer you away from wrong paths, but to free you from limiting self-concepts that would prevent you from recognizing right paths when they appear. Sometimes you have to lose who you thought you were supposed to be to discover who you actually are. This brings us to one of Jung's most profound concepts, the process of individuation, where rejection becomes not just guidance toward external opportunities, but guidance toward the full realization of your authentic self. This is where rejection transforms from something that happens to you into something that develops you, a force that's actively shaping you into the person you're meant to become. The privilege of a lifetime, Jung wrote, is being who you are. But what he discovered about this process of becoming who you are, what he called individuation, would challenge everything you've been taught about personal development. Individuation isn't about improving yourself to gain more acceptance. It's about using rejection as a developmental force that strips away everything you're not, so that what you truly are can finally emerge. Jung understood that becoming your authentic self is not a comfortable process of gradual improvement. It's a revolutionary transformation that requires you to die to false identifications and be reborn into your essential nature. And rejection, rather than being an obstacle to this process, is often the very mechanism through which individuation occurs. Let me explain what individuation actually means, because it's profoundly different from self-improvement or personal development as typically understood. Individuation is the psychological process by which you differentiate yourself from the collective patterns, expectations, and conditioning that have shaped your personality and discover the unique configuration of consciousness that is authentically yours. This process requires you to develop what Jung called the courage to be disliked, not because you're seeking conflict, but because authentic self-expression will naturally be incompatible with people and systems that require your inauthenticity to function properly. The very act of becoming who you truly are will trigger rejection from those who preferred your conditioned, controllable version. Let me tell you about Michael, whose journey through rejection became a masterclass in individuation. Michael grew up in a family of high-achieving lawyers. From childhood, he was groomed to follow the family tradition: law school, partnership in the family firm, marriage to an appropriate woman, children raised in the same high-achievement paradigm. Michael dutifully followed this script through his 20s. He excelled in law school, joined the family firm, married a woman his family approved of, and was on track to become a partner by age 35. From the outside, his life looked perfect. He had status, financial security, family approval, and social acceptance. But inside, Michael felt like he was slowly dying. The work felt meaningless to him. His marriage was based more on compatibility of backgrounds than genuine connection. His social life consisted of networking events and obligatory family gatherings. He was successful at being who everyone expected him to be, but he had no idea who he actually was beneath all these expectations. The first stage of Michael's individuation began with what Jung called the breakdown of the persona. Michael started experiencing anxiety attacks during important meetings. He found himself unable to sleep, haunted by dreams of being trapped in elaborate mazes. His body was rejecting the life his mind had accepted. When Michael finally admitted to his family that he was struggling, their response was swift and rejecting. His father accused him of being weak and ungrateful. His mother suggested therapy to help him adjust his attitude. His wife threatened to leave if he didn't get his act together. His colleagues began questioning his commitment to the firm. This collective rejection pushed Michael into what Jung called the dark night of the soul, a period of identity dissolution where all external supports for his sense of self were stripped away. Michael felt like he was losing everything: his career trajectory, his marriage, his family relationships, his social identity. He was experiencing rejection on every level of his life. But something profound was happening beneath this apparent breakdown. With his false identifications under assault, Michael began to discover aspects of himself that had been suppressed for decades. He remembered his childhood love of writing, his fascination with psychology, his deep concern for social justice issues that his legal career never addressed. The second stage of individuation began when Michael made a choice that shocked everyone who knew him. He left his position at the family firm to become a public defender. The rejection this decision triggered was severe. His family accused him of throwing his life away. His wife divorced him. His former colleagues treated him as if he had suffered a mental breakdown. But for the first time in his adult life, Michael felt like he was living from his authentic center. The work was challenging and often frustrating, but it aligned with his genuine values. He was using his legal skills to serve people who couldn't afford quality representation rather than helping wealthy clients become wealthier. The rejection from his previous world felt like liberation from a prison he hadn't realized he was in. The third stage of Michael's individuation involved integrating his shadow, the aspects of himself he had rejected, to maintain his acceptable persona. As a successful lawyer from a privileged family, Michael had suppressed his identification with the underdog, his anger at systemic injustice, his artistic sensibilities, and his emotional depth. Working with people who had been marginalized by the system brought these shadow qualities back into his conscious awareness. Michael discovered that his capacity for empathy, his artistic sensitivity, and his righteous anger were not weaknesses to be suppressed, but strengths to be integrated into his professional and personal identity. The final stage of individuation involved what Jung called the transcendent function, the integration of conscious and unconscious, persona and shadow, individual desires and collective responsibilities. Michael developed the ability to use his legal training in service of his authentic values while maintaining the social skills necessary to be effective in professional contexts. Michael's story illustrates the 4 stages of individuation through rejection that Jung identified. Stage 1. Persona breakdown. The false self that you've constructed to gain acceptance begins to feel suffocating. Your body, emotions, or circumstances start rejecting the life your conditioned mind has accepted. This often manifests as anxiety, depression, or external crises that force you to question your current path. Stage 2. Shadow encounter. The rejection of your persona creates space for the disowned aspects of yourself to emerge. Qualities you've suppressed to maintain acceptability begin demanding integration. This stage often involves being rejected by people who preferred your masked version. Stage 3. conscious differentiation. You develop the ability to distinguish between authentic self-expression and conditioned role-playing. You learn to act from your genuine nature rather than reacting from your wounds or conditioning. This often triggers more rejection as you stop fulfilling others' expectations. Stage 4. Transcendent integration. You develop the capacity to express your authentic nature while maintaining appropriate social functionality. You can wear personas consciously when necessary, without losing touch with who you really are underneath them. Each stage involves facing and moving through different types of rejection. But Jung understood that this rejection serves the individuation process by forcing you to develop internal sources of validation rather than depending on external approval. Every person or situation that rejects your authentic expression is helping you build psychological independence. This is radically different from how most people understand personal development. Instead of trying to become more acceptable to others, individuation asks you to become more acceptable to yourself. Instead of adapting to external expectations, it asks you to discover and express your internal truth. Instead of avoiding rejection, it asks you to use rejection as developmental feedback. But Jung also understood that individuation is not a selfish process. As you become more authentically yourself, you become more capable of genuine service to others. Michael's journey from corporate lawyer to public defender wasn't just personal fulfillment. It was finding a way to contribute his unique gifts in service of something larger than himself. This is the paradox of individuation. The more fully you become yourself, the more capable you become of authentic connection and service. But this requires passing through a phase where you appear selfish or irresponsible to people who benefited from your inauthenticity. The individuation process also involves what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. Michael had to learn to integrate his privileged background with his concern for the underprivileged, his intellectual training with his emotional intuition, his individual needs with his responsibilities to others. This integration creates psychological wholeness rather than one-sided development. Think about your own individuation journey. What aspects of your conditioning have you begun to question? What rejections have forced you to discover who you are beneath your socially acceptable persona? What parts of yourself are demanding integration despite the risk of social disapproval? Comment below. Can you identify which stage of individuation you're currently navigating? What rejections are serving your development right now, even if they don't feel supportive? Jung warned that individuation is not a linear process. You don't complete one stage and move permanently to the next. Life continues to present situations that call different aspects of your authentic self forward, and each new level of authenticity can trigger new waves of rejection from people who preferred your previous version. But each cycle of rejection and integration builds what Jung called psychological immunity, the capacity to maintain your authentic center regardless of external approval or disapproval. You develop what he described as an internal marriage between your conscious intentions and unconscious wisdom that creates unshakable self-knowledge. The most profound aspect of individuation through rejection is that it transforms your relationship to belonging. Instead of trying to fit into existing groups and systems, you become capable of creating authentic community with people who appreciate your real nature. Instead of seeking acceptance from everyone, you become attractive to the specific people with whom you have genuine compatibility. Michael discovered this when he met Sarah, a woman who was attracted to his authenticity rather than his status. Their relationship was based on genuine appreciation for each other's values and character, rather than social compatibility or family approval. The rejection of his first marriage had created space for authentic love to emerge. This is the promise of individuation, that by using rejection as a developmental force rather than avoiding it as a threat, you can discover and express the unique configuration of consciousness that is authentically yours. You can develop the psychological strength to be who you really are in a world that often rewards conformity over authenticity. But individuation is not just a personal journey. Jung understood that every person who completes this process makes it easier for others to do the same. Your willingness to face rejection for being authentic creates permission for others to do likewise. Your psychological courage serves the collective evolution of consciousness. This brings us to a crucial understanding. Sometimes the rejection you experience is not just about personal incompatibility, but about your consciousness evolving beyond what the collective is ready to accept. This is where we enter the territory of what Jung called the collective unconscious, and how individual authenticity can threaten established social paradigms. Throughout history, humanity's greatest breakthroughs have come from individuals who were willing to face collective rejection for expressing truths that challenged existing paradigms. Jung understood that sometimes the rejection you experience isn't about personal inadequacy or even individual incompatibility. It's about your consciousness evolving beyond what the collective is ready to accept. This is perhaps the most profound and challenging aspect of rejection as guidance. Recognizing when society's no is actually confirmation that you're on the path toward paradigm-breaking truth. Jung himself experienced this phenomenon firsthand. When he broke from Freud and developed his theories about the collective unconscious, synchronicity, and individuation, he wasn't just rejected by individual colleagues, he was rejected by the entire psychiatric establishment. His ideas were too radical, too spiritual, too threatening to the materialist paradigm that dominated early 20th century psychology. But Jung recognized something crucial about collective rejection. It often signals that you're touching on truths that the prevailing consciousness isn't ready to integrate. The very intensity of collective resistance can indicate that you're approaching something important enough to threaten established ways of thinking and being. Let me tell you about Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis, whose story perfectly illustrates how collective rejection can signal paradigm-breaking insight. In the 1840s, Semmelweis was a Hungarian physician working in maternity wards in Vienna. He noticed that women giving birth in wards staffed by doctors had much higher rates of childbed fever and death than women giving birth in wards staffed by midwives. Through careful observation, Semmelweis realized that doctors were performing autopsies in the morning and then delivering babies in the afternoon without washing their hands. He hypothesized that doctors were carrying cadaverous particles from corpses to birthing mothers, causing fatal infections. This was decades before germ theory was accepted by medical science. Semmelweis instituted a policy requiring doctors to wash their hands with chlorinated lime solution before examining patients. The results were dramatic. Mortality rates dropped from 18% to less than 2%. Semmelweis had discovered a simple practice that was saving hundreds of lives. But instead of celebrating his breakthrough, the medical establishment rejected Semmelweis with shocking vehemence. His colleagues were insulted by the suggestion that their hands could be unclean. The idea that invisible particles could cause disease contradicted the dominant medical theories of the time. Hospital administrators were threatened by implications that their institutions were causing unnecessary deaths. Semmelweis was ridiculed, ostracized, and eventually fired from his position. He tried to promote his findings through lectures and publications, but the medical community dismissed him as a radical troublemaker. The psychological pressure of collective rejection eventually contributed to a mental breakdown, and Semmelweis died in an asylum in 1865. 20 years later, Louis Pasteur's work on germ theory vindicated everything Semmelweis had discovered. Hand-washing became standard medical practice, and Semmelweis was posthumously recognized as a pioneer who saved countless lives. The same medical establishment that had rejected him now celebrated him as a visionary. Semmelweis's story illustrates a pattern Jung observed repeatedly. Paradigm-breaking insights initially trigger collective rejection because they threaten the assumptions on which existing systems are built. The more profound the insight, the more intense the resistance. The collective unconscious protects itself from truths it's not ready to integrate by rejecting the messengers who carry those truths. But Jung saw this collective rejection as serving an important function in human evolution. Ideas that are too advanced for their time need to be carried by individuals with enough psychological strength to withstand collective disapproval. These individuals serve as bridges between current consciousness and emerging possibilities. Their willingness to face rejection preserves revolutionary insights until the collective is ready to receive them. This understanding completely reframes how you might interpret your own experiences of collective rejection. If you've ever felt like your values, perspectives, or ways of being are consistently misunderstood or dismissed by mainstream society, you might be experiencing what Jung called the burden of the pioneer. You might be carrying insights that are ahead of their time. Consider the environmental activists of the 1960s who were dismissed as radical extremists, the computer programmers of the 1970s who were seen as anti-social nerds, the entrepreneurs who were rejected by traditional business for proposing ideas that seemed impossible. Many of these individuals experienced years of collective rejection before their insights were recognized as valuable contributions to human progress. The key to understanding collective rejection as guidance lies in recognizing the difference between rejection based on inadequacy and rejection based on paradigm threat. When your authentic expression consistently triggers defensive reactions from established systems, when your ideas are dismissed without serious consideration, when your way of being is labeled as dangerous or irresponsible despite evidence of its value, these can be signs that you're touching on truths that challenge existing power structures. Jung identified several characteristics of collective rejection that signal paradigm-breaking potential. First, the rejection is disproportionate to any actual threat you pose. Semmelweis was suggesting a simple hygiene practice, but he was treated as if he were attacking the entire foundation of medical authority. When collective reactions are more intense than your actual challenge warrants, you might be triggering unconscious fears about paradigm change. Second, the rejection involves emotional rather than rational responses. Jung noticed that paradigm-threatening ideas often trigger irrational anger, fear, or dismissal rather than thoughtful engagement. When people can't explain why your ideas are wrong but react with intense negative emotion, you might be approaching truths they're not psychologically ready to accept. Third, the rejection comes from institutional authorities rather than just individuals. When established systems, educational, medical, political, religious, coordinate to dismiss your insights, it often indicates that your ideas threaten the assumptions on which those systems depend for their authority. Fourth, the rejection persists despite evidence supporting your position. Semmelweis had clear data showing that hand-washing saved lives, but the medical establishment continued to reject his findings. When evidence is ignored or dismissed, the rejection is usually about protecting existing paradigms rather than evaluating truth. But Jung also warned about the shadow side of interpreting collective rejection as paradigm breaking. This understanding can be misused to justify genuinely harmful ideas or to avoid legitimate feedback about problematic behavior. The key is learning to distinguish between rejection that stems from paradigm threat and rejection that stems from actual inadequacy or harm. True paradigm-breaking insights share certain characteristics. They're based on careful observation rather than wishful thinking. They can be tested and verified by others. They serve human well-being rather than just personal ego, and they're proposed with genuine humility rather than grandiose claims about being misunderstood genius. The most important aspect of navigating collective rejection is maintaining what Jung called conscious suffering. This means staying open to the possibility that the collective might be right about your inadequacies, while also remaining committed to truths you've discovered that challenge existing paradigms. It's a delicate balance between humility and conviction that requires tremendous psychological strength. Let me share a personal example of navigating collective rejection. Early in my career, I proposed ideas about consciousness and psychology that challenged both materialist science and traditional spirituality. I experienced rejection from academic institutions that found my ideas too spiritual, from spiritual communities that found them too scientific, and from mainstream psychology that found them too radical. For years, I questioned whether this rejection meant I was deluding myself about the value of my insights. I wondered if I was just another person using ahead of my time as an excuse for ideas that were actually inadequate. The psychological pressure of collective disapproval was intense enough to make me consider abandoning these explorations entirely. But over time, I began to notice that my ideas were resonating with individuals who were having similar experiences and observations. People were privately reaching out to tell me that my work was helping them make sense of phenomena they had experienced but couldn't discuss in conventional contexts. A community of people interested in these perspectives began to emerge. I realized that the collective rejection I was experiencing wasn't evidence that my ideas were wrong. It was evidence that they challenged assumptions that weren't ready to be questioned by mainstream institutions. The rejection was serving to connect me with the specific people who were ready for these perspectives, while protecting me from having to compromise my insights to fit into systems that couldn't accommodate them. Comment below. Have you ever experienced collective rejection for ideas, values, or ways of being that you believe serve genuine human well-being? How did you navigate the psychological challenge of maintaining conviction while remaining open to legitimate feedback? Jung understood that collective rejection serves multiple functions in human evolution. It protects the collective from changes it's not ready to integrate, but it also preserves revolutionary insights by connecting their carriers with others who share similar consciousness. It creates what Jung called cultural bridges, small communities of people who maintain advanced perspectives until the broader culture is ready to receive them. But perhaps most importantly, collective rejection serves as a test of psychological strength for paradigm pioneers. Ideas that can change the world need to be carried by people with enough inner authority to withstand external disapproval. The rejection process itself develops the psychological immunity necessary to maintain revolutionary insights under pressure. This is why Jung saw collective rejection not as punishment but as initiation. Every person willing to face societal disapproval for expressing paradigm-breaking truths is undergoing a form of psychological initiation that develops the inner strength necessary to serve human evolution. They are being trained by rejection to become bridges between current consciousness and emerging possibilities. This understanding transforms the meaning of social isolation, professional disappointment, and cultural misunderstanding. Instead of seeing these experiences as evidence of failure, You can recognize them as potential indicators that your consciousness is evolving faster than the collective systems around you. Your rejection might be protecting insights that will eventually serve humanity's development. But this initiation through collective rejection leads to profound questions about timing, synchronicity, and the intelligence that orchestrates human development. Sometimes rejection isn't just guidance away from wrong paths or protection from paradigm threat. It's the universe's way of orchestrating perfect timing for breakthrough and revelation. This is where we enter Jung's most mysterious teaching, the role of synchronicity in rejection experiences. In 1952, Carl Jung introduced a concept that would revolutionize our understanding of meaningful coincidence, synchronicity. He defined it as the simultaneous occurrence of two meaningfully but not causally connected events. But what Jung discovered about synchronicity and rejection goes far deeper than simple coincidence. He found that rejection experiences often occur with such precise timing that they appear to be orchestrated by an intelligence that transcends individual psychology, an intelligence that knows exactly when you need to be redirected, protected, or prepared for opportunities that haven't yet appeared. Jung's insight into synchronistic rejection challenges everything you've been taught about cause and effect. It suggests that rejection isn't just random disappointment or even personal guidance. It's part of a larger pattern of meaningful events that are perfectly timed to serve your authentic development and life purpose. Every rejection contains not just information about compatibility, but information about timing. Let me share a story that perfectly illustrates this principle. Lisa had been working toward becoming a documentary filmmaker for 5 years. She had completed film school, created several short documentaries, and was finally ready to pitch her dream project, a film about environmental conservation in her home state. Lisa spent months preparing her pitch for a major documentary fund that provided grants to emerging filmmakers. She researched every aspect of the application process, crafted a compelling proposal, and assembled a professional presentation. She was convinced this grant would launch her career and allow her to create the film she felt called to make. When the rejection letter arrived, Lisa was devastated. The fund had received over 500 applications for only 10 grants, and despite her preparation and passion, she hadn't been selected. She felt like her entire career trajectory had been derailed. She had no backup plan and no other source of funding for such an ambitious project. But something strange began happening in the weeks following this rejection. Lisa started noticing news stories about environmental issues that she hadn't been aware of when she submitted her proposal. A major oil spill had occurred in a nearby state, creating a crisis that was directly related to the conservation issues she wanted to address in her documentary. Then Lisa received an unexpected phone call from a journalist who had been covering the oil spill. Someone had given him Lisa's name as a filmmaker interested in environmental issues. The journalist explained that several news organizations were looking for documentary filmmakers to create content about the spill's long-term environmental impact. The funding available for this urgent project was substantially more than the grant Lisa had been rejected for. Lisa realized that if she had received the original grant, she would have been committed to her planned project and unable to respond to this unexpected opportunity. The rejection had kept her available for a project that was not only better funded, but also more timely and impactful than what she had originally proposed. As Lisa worked on the oil spill documentary, more synchronicities emerged. She met environmental scientists whose research perfectly complemented her filmmaking skills. She discovered communities affected by the spill, whose stories needed to be told with exactly the sensitivity and creativity that were her natural gifts. The documentary she created became a catalyst for policy changes that helped prevent similar disasters. Looking back, Lisa could see that her original grant rejection had been perfectly timed to redirect her toward work that was not only more fulfilling personally, but also more significant in its impact. The rejection hadn't been blocking her path, it had been clearing her calendar for an opportunity that was precisely aligned with both her skills and the world's needs at that moment. This is what Jung meant by synchronistic rejection, rejections that occur with such precise timing that they appear to be orchestrated by an intelligence that can see the larger pattern of your life development. These rejections often seem devastating in the moment, but later reveal themselves to have been perfectly timed to protect you from lesser opportunities or prepare you for greater ones. Jung identified several characteristics of synchronistic rejection that distinguish it from random disappointment. First, the timing seems suspiciously perfect. The rejection occurs just before an opportunity emerges that you wouldn't have been available for if you had gotten what you originally wanted. Lisa's grant rejection happened months before the oil spill, but just early enough to keep her available when the documentary opportunity arose. Second, the rejection leads to opportunities that are better aligned with your authentic gifts than what you originally pursued. Lisa discovered that documenting urgent environmental crises engaged her skills more fully than her original conservation project would have. Third, the rejection connects you with people or circumstances that become significant in your life development. The rejection often serves as a catalyst that brings you into contact with individuals who become important collaborators, mentors, or friends. Fourth, the rejection seems to serve not just your individual development, but also some larger purpose or need. Lisa's documentary served environmental protection efforts in ways that her original project couldn't have accomplished. But Jung also warned about the danger of seeing synchronicity where it doesn't exist. Not every rejection is synchronistic guidance from the universe. Sometimes rejection is simply incompatibility, poor timing, or inadequate preparation. The key is learning to distinguish between rejections that are part of a larger meaningful pattern and rejections that are just random disappointments. True synchronistic rejection often involves what Jung called meaningful coincidence, events that are connected by meaning rather than causation. When Lisa's grant rejection was followed by the oil spill and subsequent documentary opportunity, there was no causal connection between these events. But there was a meaningful connection that served her authentic development. Let me share another example that illustrates the difference between synchronistic rejection and ordinary disappointment. David was a software engineer who had been trying to get hired by a prestigious tech company for over 2 years. He applied for multiple positions, went through several interview processes, and was consistently rejected despite having strong qualifications. Initially, David interpreted these rejections as evidence that he wasn't good enough for top-tier companies. He spent months improving his technical skills and networking with employees, convinced that if he just worked harder, he would eventually gain acceptance. But the rejections continued. The breakthrough came when David stopped trying to get hired by prestigious companies and started working on a personal project that genuinely excited him, an app that would help people with disabilities navigate public transportation more easily. He had been inspired by his sister's struggles as a wheelchair user, and the project felt deeply meaningful to him. As David developed this app, he began connecting with disability advocacy organizations and transportation authorities. His work caught the attention of a government agency that was launching an accessibility initiative. They offered him a position leading their technology development, a role that was better paid and more impactful than anything he could have found at the prestigious companies that had rejected him. The synchronicity became clear when David learned that the government initiative had been in planning stages for years, but had only received funding approval the month before he completed his accessibility app. If he had been hired by one of the tech companies earlier, he would have been unavailable when this perfectly aligned opportunity emerged. But the most profound synchronicity was yet to come. David's work on accessibility technology led him to meet Sarah, a policy researcher working on disability rights, at a conference related to his new job. They discovered an instant connection based not just on romantic attraction, but on shared values and complementary professional skills. They eventually married and collaborated on projects that combined his technical expertise with her policy knowledge. David realized that all those rejections from tech companies hadn't been random disappointments. They had been part of a synchronistic pattern that was guiding him toward work that was more aligned with his authentic values and toward a relationship that was based on genuine compatibility rather than social or professional networking. This is the profound mystery of synchronistic rejection. It often appears to be orchestrated by an intelligence that can see the long-term trajectory of your life in ways your conscious mind cannot. The rejection that seems to close one door is actually part of a pattern that's opening exactly the right door at exactly the right time. Jung understood that synchronicity operates according to what he called the principle of meaningful connection. Events that appear unrelated from a causal perspective are actually connected by meaning and purpose. Your rejection from one opportunity creates the space and timing necessary for a better opportunity to emerge, even when you can't see the connection at the time. But recognizing synchronistic rejection requires developing what Jung called symbolic consciousness, the ability to see patterns and meaning in events that appear random to rational analysis. This requires a fundamental shift from trying to control outcomes through force to learning to collaborate with the larger intelligence that orchestrates meaningful coincidence. This doesn't mean becoming passive or fatalistic. Synchronistic rejection often requires you to take inspired action based on authentic passion rather than strategic calculation. David's breakthrough came not from trying harder to get hired by prestigious companies, but from following his genuine inspiration to create something meaningful. The key to working with synchronistic rejection is learning to distinguish between effort that flows from authentic inspiration and effort that stems from ego attachment to specific outcomes. When you're aligned with synchronistic timing, your actions feel energized and doors tend to open more easily. When you're forcing against synchronistic timing, everything feels like an uphill battle. Jung also recognized that synchronistic rejection often involves what he called the transcendent function, the mechanism by which the unconscious communicates with consciousness through meaningful events. Your psyche uses external circumstances, including rejection, to guide you toward experiences that will facilitate your authentic development. But the most profound aspect of synchronistic rejection is that it often serves multiple purposes simultaneously. Lisa's grant rejection guided her toward better work, connected her with significant people, and served environmental protection efforts. David's tech company rejections guided him toward meaningful work, introduced him to his life partner, and created solutions for people with disabilities. This multi-layered synchronicity suggests that rejection experiences are often part of a larger web of meaningful connections that serves not just individual development, but collective needs. Your authentic expression, guided by synchronistic rejection, often turns out to serve purposes larger than your personal fulfillment. Comment below. Can you think of a rejection in your life that seemed random at the time, but later revealed itself to be perfectly timed? What larger purpose or pattern did it serve? But Jung warned that working with synchronistic rejection requires developing what he called conscious participation in the process. This means learning to recognize synchronistic patterns while taking responsibility for responding to them appropriately. You can't just wait for the universe to deliver opportunities. You have to be willing to act on the guidance you receive through rejection. The most challenging aspect of synchronistic rejection is that it often requires you to let go of specific outcomes and trust in a process that operates beyond your conscious understanding. This requires developing faith not in particular results, but in the intelligence of the process itself. Jung discovered that people who learn to work consciously with synchronistic rejection often find that their lives become increasingly meaningful and impactful. They stop struggling against circumstances and start collaborating with the larger patterns that are orchestrating their development. They learn to see rejection not as obstacle, but as redirection toward opportunities that are better aligned with their authentic purpose. But this understanding of synchronistic rejection can only be fully appreciated when you understand how to navigate the psychological crisis that often accompanies major rejection experiences. Before synchronicity becomes visible, before guidance becomes clear, there's usually a period of darkness where everything you thought you knew about yourself and your path seems to dissolve. This is what Jung called the dark night of the soul, and it's often the crucible in which authentic self-knowledge is forged. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, Jung wrote, but by making the darkness conscious. But what Jung discovered about the psychological crisis that follows major rejection, what he called the encounter with the void, would challenge everything you've been taught about healing and recovery. The dark night that follows profound rejection isn't something to be quickly overcome or medicated away. It's a sacred process of identity dissolution that creates space for a more authentic self to emerge. Jung understood that certain rejections are so complete, so identity-shattering, that they don't just close specific doors, they collapse entire structures of meaning around which you've organized your life. These rejections create what he called the confrontation with the void, a psychological crisis where everything you thought you knew about yourself, your worth, and your place in the world seems to dissolve into nothingness. This is not the ordinary disappointment of not getting what you want. This is the existential crisis of discovering that who you thought you were was largely an illusion, and now you must face the terrifying question, if I'm not who I thought I was, then who am I? Let me tell you about Rebecca, whose journey through the dark night of rejection became a profound initiation into authentic selfhood. Rebecca had built her entire identity around being a wife and mother. For 22 years, she had devoted herself completely to her husband and 3 children, finding meaning and purpose in nurturing their dreams and supporting their achievements. When her youngest child left for college, Rebecca expected to feel proud and accomplished. Instead, she felt lost and empty. She had no idea who she was outside of her roles as caretaker and supporter. Worse, when she tried to share these feelings with her husband, hoping to rediscover their connection as a couple, he told her he had been having an affair for 3 years and wanted a divorce. The rejection was complete and devastating. Rebecca wasn't just losing her marriage, she was losing the entire structure of meaning around which she had organized her life. Her husband's rejection of her wasn't just about incompatibility. It was a rejection of the very self she had spent decades becoming. The woman who had sacrificed her own dreams to support his, who had made his comfort and success her highest priority, was being discarded as irrelevant. But the psychological crisis went even deeper. As Rebecca began to confront the reality of rebuilding her life, she realized she had no idea what she actually wanted for herself. She had spent so many years anticipating and fulfilling others' needs that she had lost touch with her own desires, preferences, and authentic nature. She felt like she was staring into an abyss of nothingness where her sense of self should have been. This is what Jung called the encounter with the void, the psychological state that occurs when external structures of identity are stripped away and you're forced to confront the question of who you are beneath all your roles, achievements, and relationships. It's terrifying because it reveals how much of what you thought was you was actually just adaptation to others' expectations and needs. The dark night of rejection serves several crucial psychological functions that Jung identified. First, it dissolves false identifications. Rebecca's identity as the perfect wife and mother wasn't entirely authentic. It was partly a persona she had constructed to avoid the rejection of being seen as selfish or inadequate. The collapse of this identity, while painful, created space for her authentic self to emerge. Second, it forces encounter with the shadow. In the void left by dissolved personas, the aspects of yourself you've rejected to maintain acceptability begin to surface. Rebecca discovered anger, ambition, creativity, and independence that she had suppressed to fulfill her caretaker role. These shadow qualities initially felt foreign and threatening, but they were essential parts of her authentic nature. Third, it develops psychological independence. When external sources of validation are removed, you're forced to develop internal sources of worth and meaning. Rebecca had to learn to value herself based on her own recognition of her worth rather than others' appreciation of her service. Fourth, it creates space for authentic rebirth. The void isn't just emptiness, it's potential. Like fertile darkness of soil, it contains the seeds of a more authentic way of being that couldn't emerge while you were identified with false structures of self. But Jung also understood that navigating the dark night of rejection requires tremendous psychological courage and often support from people who have traveled similar paths. The temptation is always to quickly fill the void with new external sources of identity and validation, rather than using it as an opportunity for authentic self-discovery. Rebecca's journey through the void was neither quick nor comfortable. She spent months in what felt like psychological freefall, not knowing who she was or what she wanted. Well-meaning friends encouraged her to get back out there and start dating, to find a hobby or join some groups. But Rebecca intuitively understood that she needed to sit with the emptiness long enough to discover what wanted to emerge from within it. The breakthrough came when Rebecca stopped trying to fill the void and started listening to it. In the silence left by the absence of others' needs and expectations, she began to hear her own authentic voice, quiet at first, but gradually becoming clearer and stronger. Rebecca discovered that she had always been interested in social justice, but had never pursued it because her husband found activism too political. She remembered artistic talents that she had abandoned when family responsibilities took priority. She recognized leadership abilities that had been channeled into managing household logistics, but that yearned for broader expression. Most importantly, Rebecca discovered that she had a gift for helping other women navigate life transitions. Her own journey through rejection and identity dissolution had developed in her a deep empathy for others facing similar crises. She began volunteering with a women's center, then trained as a peer counselor, and eventually started her own practice helping divorced women rebuild their lives. The work was deeply fulfilling in ways that her previous identity never had been. Instead of deriving worth from others' appreciation of her service, Rebecca found meaning in using her authentic gifts to create positive change. Instead of defining herself through relationships with family members, she developed a sense of self based on her own values and abilities. But perhaps most profoundly, Rebecca discovered that the dark night of rejection had been necessary for her authentic development. She realized that if her marriage had continued successfully, she would never have been forced to discover who she actually was beneath her caretaker persona. The rejection that had seemed to destroy her life had actually liberated her from a life that was too small for her authentic nature. Jung understood that the dark night of rejection often feels like psychological death because, in a sense, it is death. The death of false identifications that have outlived their usefulness. But this death is followed by rebirth into a more authentic way of being, if you have the courage to stay with the process, rather than quickly seeking new external sources of identity. The key stages of navigating the dark night that Jung identified are: Stage 1, identity dissolution. The external structures of meaning collapse, creating a sense of psychological void. This stage often involves intense fear, grief, and disorientation. The temptation is to quickly rebuild familiar structures rather than exploring what the emptiness might be revealing. Stage 2, shadow encounter. The aspects of yourself that were suppressed to maintain the previous identity begin to surface. This often feels threatening because these qualities seem incompatible with who you thought you were. The challenge is learning to welcome rather than reject these emerging aspects of yourself. Stage 3, authentic exploration. In the space created by identity dissolution, you begin experimenting with new ways of being that feel more genuinely aligned with your authentic nature. This stage requires willingness to disappoint people who preferred your previous version. Stage 4, integrated rebirth. You develop a new sense of identity that incorporates both your authentic nature and appropriate social functionality. This new identity is more flexible and less dependent on external validation than previous identifications. But Jung warned that the dark night of rejection can be dangerous if navigated without adequate support or understanding. The psychological dissolution can become pathological if you try to avoid the process through addiction, denial, or premature relationship rebounds. It can also become chronic if you get stuck in victim identity rather than using the crisis for authentic development. The most important support during the dark night is often other people who have successfully navigated similar experiences. Rebecca found tremendous healing in connecting with other divorced women who had also discovered authentic self-expression through the crisis of marital rejection. Their shared understanding and encouragement helped her trust the process rather than rushing to escape it. Jung also emphasized the importance of what he called holding the tension, staying present with difficult emotions rather than immediately seeking relief. This requires developing tolerance for psychological discomfort and learning to see crisis as information rather than emergency. Comment below. Have you experienced a rejection so complete that it dissolved your sense of identity? What did you discover about yourself in the emptiness that followed? How did that crisis serve your authentic development? The dark night of rejection also often involves what Jung called the encounter with meaning. In the void left by collapsed external structures, you're forced to confront fundamental questions about what actually matters to you. Rebecca discovered that meaning came not from fulfilling others' expectations, but from using her gifts in service of causes she genuinely cared about. But perhaps most importantly, Jung understood that successfully navigating the dark night of rejection transforms your relationship to all future rejections. Once you've discovered that you can survive the complete dissolution of your identity and emerge more authentic than before, rejection loses much of its terror. You develop what he called psychological immunity, the capacity to maintain your authentic center regardless of external approval or disapproval. This psychological immunity doesn't mean becoming hardened or indifferent to others' responses. It means developing such a secure relationship with your authentic self that external rejection can't threaten your fundamental sense of worth. You can remain open and responsive to feedback while maintaining unshakable self-knowledge. Rebecca discovered this when she began dating again several years after her divorce. Instead of trying to become what potential partners wanted, she remained authentic to her newly discovered self. This attracted some people and repelled others, but the rejections no longer felt like judgments of her worth. They simply indicated incompatibility, which freed her to connect with people who could appreciate her authentic nature. The dark night of rejection, when navigated consciously, becomes what Jung called a sacred initiation, a process that strips away everything inauthentic to reveal the golden core of your true self. It's painful, but it's not punishment. It's the psyche's way of liberating you from identifications that have become prisons. But this understanding of rejection's role in authentic development reveals something crucial about how rejection operates in the most intimate realm of human experience: romantic relationships. This is where rejection's guidance function becomes most complex and most transformative, as the heart learns to distinguish between love that diminishes and love that liberates. In the realm of romantic love, rejection reveals its most sophisticated and mysterious function. Jung understood that romantic rejection operates as what he called love's fierce filter, a mechanism that removes incompatible connections to make space for authentic intimacy. But what society has taught you about romantic rejection is almost entirely backwards. You've been conditioned to see romantic rejection as evidence of your inadequacy when it's actually evidence of mismatch, and to pursue relationships based on acceptance when the most transformative love often emerges from initial rejection. Jung discovered that the fear of romantic rejection creates more suffering in relationships than actual rejection ever could. This fear drives people to present false versions of themselves, to stay in incompatible relationships, and to miss opportunities for genuine connection because they're so focused on avoiding the pain of being unwanted. But what if romantic rejection, rather than being love's enemy, is actually love's guardian, protecting your heart from connections that would diminish rather than fulfill your capacity for authentic intimacy? Let me tell you about Anna and Thomas, whose story perfectly illustrates how romantic rejection can serve authentic love. Anna met Thomas at a professional conference and felt immediately drawn to his intelligence, humor, and apparent confidence. They had engaging conversations, shared interests, and what seemed like natural chemistry. When Thomas asked for her number, Anna felt excited about the possibility of a meaningful relationship. But as they began dating, Anna noticed that she was constantly editing herself around Thomas. His humor was often sarcastic and slightly mean-spirited, and when Anna expressed her discomfort, he dismissed her as too sensitive. His confidence revealed itself to be a need to be right about everything, making Anna feel like her perspectives were unwelcome. His intelligence was deployed as a weapon to win arguments, rather than as a gift to understand her more deeply. Despite these red flags, Anna continued the relationship because Thomas hadn't rejected her. In fact, he seemed quite interested in continuing to date, which Anna interpreted as evidence that they were compatible. She told herself that her discomfort was probably her own insecurity, that she should be grateful for his attention, that maybe she was indeed too sensitive. The relationship continued for 8 months, during which Anna slowly lost touch with her authentic self. She stopped expressing opinions that might challenge Thomas's positions. She suppressed her emotional sensitivity to avoid his dismissive responses. She began to see her natural empathy and emotional intelligence as weaknesses rather than gifts. The end came when Anna finally shared some personal struggles with Thomas, hoping for support and understanding. Instead of offering comfort, Thomas became impatient and told her she was creating drama and needed to deal with her issues before they could have a serious relationship. His rejection of her vulnerability felt like a rejection of her essential self. But something profound happened in that moment of rejection. Instead of feeling devastated, Anna felt relieved. Thomas's rejection of her authentic emotional nature clarified something she had been trying to deny. He wasn't capable of loving her real self. His acceptance had been conditional on her suppressing the very qualities that made her who she was. Anna realized that she had been so afraid of romantic rejection that she had rejected herself first, hiding her sensitivity, empathy, and emotional depth to maintain his interest. His final rejection of these qualities freed her from a relationship that was requiring her to betray her authentic nature to avoid abandonment. 6 months later, Anna met James at a volunteer event for a cause she cared about. James was immediately drawn to Anna's emotional intelligence and her ability to connect deeply with people. When Anna shared the same vulnerabilities that Thomas had rejected, James listened with genuine interest and offered thoughtful support. He saw her sensitivity not as weakness but as a gift that enabled her to understand and help others. The contrast was stunning. Thomas had accepted Anna's false self and rejected her authentic self. James was attracted to Anna's authentic self and uninterested in false presentations. Thomas's acceptance had felt suffocating because it required self-betrayal. James's acceptance felt liberating because it was based on appreciation for who she really was. This is the profound paradox Jung discovered about romantic rejection. Sometimes the people who accept your false self are preventing you from finding people who would love your authentic self. Anna's fear of rejection had trapped her in a relationship with someone who could only love a diminished version of her. Thomas's final rejection freed her to find someone who could love her completely. Jung identified several ways that romantic rejection serves authentic love. First, it filters out incompatible partners before deeper attachment develops. If Anna and Thomas had married, she would have spent years or decades suppressing her essential nature to maintain his approval. His rejection saved her from a life of emotional self-betrayal. Second, it reveals the difference between conditional acceptance and unconditional love. Thomas's acceptance was conditional on Anna, hiding parts of herself. James's love was based on appreciation for her whole self, including the qualities she had been taught to see as problematic. Third, it forces you to choose between authenticity and approval. When someone rejects your authentic expression, you must decide whether to modify yourself for their acceptance or maintain your integrity despite their disapproval. This choice clarifies your own values and priorities. Fourth, it develops discrimination between relationships that serve your growth and relationships that require your diminishment. Each rejection teaches you something about what kinds of connections truly serve your authentic development. But Jung also understood that society's programming around romantic rejection creates immense confusion about these natural filtering processes. You're taught that being chosen is always good and being rejected is always bad, when the opposite is often true. You're encouraged to see rejection as evidence of your inadequacy rather than information about compatibility. The most toxic aspect of this programming is that it leads people to pursue partners who show interest rather than partners with whom they have genuine compatibility. Anna stayed with Thomas not because he was good for her, but because he wasn't rejecting her. She mistook his conditional acceptance for love and nearly lost herself in the process. Jung recognized that the fear of romantic rejection often stems from childhood experiences of conditional love from parents or caregivers. If your early experiences taught you that love was something you had to earn through good behavior, achievement, or role-playing, You would naturally fear that showing your authentic self would lead to abandonment. But authentic romantic love requires what Jung called the courage to be disliked by the wrong person. This means being willing to express your full self even when it might trigger rejection from someone you find attractive. It means trusting that the right person will be drawn to your authentic nature rather than repelled by it. Let me share a personal moment of vulnerability about this principle. Early in my dating life, I was convinced that being intellectual and emotionally contained would make me more attractive to potential partners. I presented myself as rational, successful, and emotionally independent, qualities I thought women would find appealing. This strategy was successful in generating initial interest, but the relationships that developed felt superficial and unsatisfying. Women were attracted to my persona but seemed uncomfortable when I showed emotional depth or vulnerability. I was experiencing the acceptance I thought I wanted, but it felt hollow because it wasn't based on knowledge of who I really was. The breakthrough came when I decided to be completely authentic with someone I was dating, even though it risked rejection. I shared my uncertainties, my emotional sensitivity, and my spiritual interests, all qualities I had been hiding because I assumed they would be unattractive. Her response was immediate rejection. She told me she preferred the confident, rational version of me and wasn't interested in someone who was so complicated. That rejection stung, but it also felt liberating. I realized that her preference for my false self meant she was never capable of loving my authentic self anyway. Her rejection freed me from trying to maintain a persona that was exhausting and ultimately unfulfilling. When I continued dating with full authenticity, I experienced more rejections initially, but the connections that did develop were based on genuine appreciation for who I actually was. Eventually, I met someone who was attracted to my emotional depth and spiritual interests, rather than being threatened by them. That relationship became a foundation for growth rather than a requirement for self-suppression. Comment below. Can you think of a romantic relationship where you suppressed aspects of yourself to avoid rejection? How did that self-betrayal affect the quality of the connection? What would have happened if you had been fully authentic from the beginning? Jung also discovered that romantic rejection often reveals what he called projected wholeness, the tendency to seek in romantic partners the qualities you've disowned in yourself. Anna was attracted to Thomas's apparent confidence, partly because she had been taught to suppress her own assertiveness. When his confidence revealed itself to be arrogance rather than genuine strength, she was forced to develop her own healthy assertiveness. This is another way romantic rejection serves authentic development. It forces you to reclaim and integrate the qualities you were seeking in another person. Instead of looking for someone to complete you, rejection teaches you to become whole within yourself, which paradoxically makes you more capable of genuine partnership. The most sophisticated understanding of romantic rejection recognizes that it often serves both individuals simultaneously. Anna's authentic emotional expression triggered Thomas's rejection because it confronted him with his own suppressed emotional nature. His rejection protected him from having to face his emotional inadequacy while protecting Anna from a relationship that would have required her self-betrayal. Both people were served by the rejection, even though only Anna initially recognized it as beneficial. Thomas remained available to find someone who could love his limited emotional range without challenging him to grow, while Anna became available to find someone who could appreciate and support her emotional depth. This understanding transforms how you navigate romantic rejection. Instead of taking every rejection personally, you can see it as information about compatibility and timing. Instead of trying to become more acceptable to people who reject your authentic self, you can become more committed to expressing your authentic self to attract compatible partners. But perhaps most importantly, understanding romantic rejection as love's filter helps you distinguish between the rejection of your persona and the rejection of your authentic self. When someone rejects your authentic expression, they're revealing their limitation, not your inadequacy. When someone accepts only your false self, they're preventing you from experiencing genuine love. Jung understood that the goal of romantic relationships isn't to avoid rejection, but to find someone who can love and support your authentic self while you do the same for them. This requires the courage to be rejected by incompatible people in order to remain available for compatible love. It requires trusting that authentic expression will naturally attract the right people while repelling the wrong ones. This principle applies not just to romantic relationships, but to all forms of professional and creative connection. Understanding how rejection operates in career contexts reveals another crucial aspect of Jung's teaching: how professional rejection often redirects us toward work that's more aligned with our authentic gifts and values. Jung understood that professional rejection operates according to the same psychological principles as romantic rejection, but with even more complex implications for authentic self-expression. Your career is not just how you make money, it's how you contribute your unique gifts to the world, how you find meaning through service, and how you express your authentic nature through work. Professional rejection, therefore, isn't just about employment. It's about alignment between your authentic nature and your life's work. But society has programmed you to approach career development through the lens of acceptability rather than authenticity. You're taught to pursue careers that are prestigious, secure, or lucrative, rather than careers that genuinely engage your natural gifts and interests. You're encouraged to modify yourself to fit existing job requirements rather than finding or creating work that utilizes your authentic talents. This approach virtually guarantees professional rejection because you're trying to force compatibility where none naturally exists. Jung discovered that professional rejection often serves as a redirect mechanism, steering you away from careers that would utilize only a fraction of your potential toward work that engages your full range of authentic gifts. But this guidance is often disguised as disappointment, failure, or inadequacy, making it difficult to recognize the intelligence behind the rejection. Let me tell you about Marcus, whose series of professional rejections led him to discover his authentic calling. Marcus graduated from business school with an MBA and immediately began pursuing positions at prestigious consulting firms. He had the academic credentials, the internship experience, and the interview skills that should have made him an attractive candidate. But despite making it through multiple rounds of interviews at various firms, Marcus consistently received rejections. The feedback was always variations of the same theme: highly qualified candidate, but not quite the right fit for our culture. Marcus interpreted this as evidence that he wasn't impressive enough, wasn't polished enough, wasn't strategic enough to succeed in high-level consulting. So Marcus spent months trying to become more impressive. He took additional courses, networked more aggressively, and studied case studies until he could recite consulting frameworks in his sleep. But the rejections continued, each not quite the right fit, felt like a personal inadequacy rather than information about compatibility. The breakthrough came when Marcus finally stopped trying to fit into consulting and started paying attention to what naturally energized him. He realized that his favorite part of business school hadn't been strategy or finance. It had been organizational psychology and change management. He was naturally gifted at understanding human dynamics within businesses and helping teams work more effectively together. Marcus began exploring roles in organizational development and human resources, fields he had previously dismissed as less prestigious than consulting. Immediately, the response was different. Instead of polite rejections, he received enthusiastic interest. Interviewers were drawn to his natural understanding of human behavior and his genuine passion for helping organizations become more effective through better people management. Within 6 months, Marcus was hired by a company specifically for his unique combination of business training and psychological insight. His role involved helping organizations navigate complex changes while maintaining employee engagement and productivity. The work utilized skills he didn't even know he possessed and engaged interests he had never been encouraged to explore. Looking back, Marcus realized that the consulting rejections hadn't been random disappointments. They had been his psyche's guidance system, steering him away from work that would have utilized only a small portion of his authentic gifts. Consulting would have engaged his analytical mind, but not his natural talent for understanding human psychology. The rejections had protected him from a career that would have been successful, but unsatisfying. This is the hidden function of professional rejection that Jung identified. It often protects you from careers that would give you external validation, but require you to suppress your authentic gifts. The very qualities that make you unsuitable for certain roles are often the qualities that make you perfectly suited for your authentic calling. Jung identified several patterns in professional rejection that indicate guidance rather than inadequacy. First, consistent rejection from similar types of positions or organizations often suggests fundamental incompatibility rather than inadequate qualifications. If you're repeatedly told you're not quite the right fit, despite having the required skills, your authentic nature might be incompatible with that type of work environment. Second, rejection feedback that focuses on cultural fit or personality rather than competence often indicates that your authentic self would be suppressed in that environment. When organizations reject you for being too creative, too questioning, or too independent, they're protecting you from work that would require self-betrayal. Third, rejections that leave you feeling relieved underneath the initial disappointment often indicate that your psyche was looking for an exit from an incompatible path. Marcus discovered that part of him was actually grateful for the consulting rejections because the work had never truly excited him. Fourth, rejection from one field that creates space for discovery of another field suggests synchronistic redirection. Marcus's consulting rejections created the time and motivation necessary for him to explore organizational psychology, which became his authentic career path. But Jung also warned about the shadow side of interpreting professional rejection. This understanding can be misused to avoid legitimate skill development or to justify giving up when facing normal professional challenges. The key is learning to distinguish between rejection that's redirecting you toward authenticity and rejection that's simply feedback about areas where you need to grow. True guidance-based professional rejection shares certain characteristics. It's consistent across similar opportunities. It focuses on fit rather than competence. It doesn't diminish your sense of personal power, and it creates space for opportunities that feel more naturally aligned with your authentic gifts. Let me share another example that illustrates this distinction. Sarah was a talented writer who had been trying to get hired by major newspapers and magazines for several years. She received consistent rejections, which she initially interpreted as evidence that her writing wasn't good enough for professional journalism. But as Sarah reflected on the feedback, she noticed a pattern. Editors appreciated her writing ability, but found her style too personal or too emotional for traditional journalism. They wanted objective reporting, but Sarah's natural gift was for deeply empathetic storytelling that connected with readers' human experiences. Instead of trying to become more objective, Sarah began exploring opportunities that valued her natural style. She started a blog about social issues that combined rigorous research with personal narrative. Her authentic voice attracted a devoted readership of people who were hungry for the kind of emotionally intelligent analysis that traditional journalism couldn't provide. The blog's success led to book contracts, speaking opportunities, and eventually, her own media platform that reached more people than she ever could have through traditional journalism. The rejections that had seemed to block her writing career had actually redirected her toward a form of communication that was more aligned with her authentic gifts. Sarah's story illustrates another crucial aspect of professional rejection. It often guides you toward creating new forms of work rather than fitting into existing categories. The qualities that make you unsuitable for traditional roles are often the same qualities that enable you to innovate within your field. Jung understood that professional rejection often signals that your authentic gifts are ahead of their time or require new contexts to be fully expressed. Instead of trying to suppress these qualities to fit existing opportunities, rejection can guide you toward creating opportunities that utilize your full potential. This is particularly relevant in our rapidly changing economy, where many of the most fulfilling careers are being created by people who couldn't fit into traditional employment structures. Professional rejection often indicates that your authentic nature is entrepreneurial, innovative, or paradigm-breaking in ways that require you to create your own opportunities, rather than waiting for others to recognize your value. But Jung also recognized that professional rejection can reveal shadow projections about work and success. Marcus's attachment to prestigious consulting was partly driven by his father's emphasis on status and achievement. The rejections forced him to examine whether he genuinely wanted that career or whether he was trying to fulfill someone else's expectations. Comment below. Can you identify professional rejections in your life that might have been protecting you from careers that weren't truly aligned with your authentic gifts? What did those rejections reveal about what kind of work genuinely energizes you? The most profound aspect of professional rejection is that it often forces you to clarify your relationship to work itself. When external validation through prestigious employment is removed, you're forced to discover what kind of contribution feels meaningful to you personally. This often leads to work that's more aligned with your values and more satisfying than what you could have achieved through traditional career advancement. Jung also understood that professional rejection often serves collective as well as individual purposes. People whose authentic gifts don't fit existing professional categories are often the ones who innovate and create new possibilities within their fields. Their rejection from traditional opportunities forces them to pioneer new approaches that eventually serve broader human needs. This innovation often extends beyond individual career satisfaction to creative expression and artistic contribution. Understanding how rejection operates in creative contexts reveals perhaps the most transformative aspect of Jung's teaching: how critical rejection can actually strengthen and refine your authentic creative voice. Jung understood that creative rejection occupies a unique position in human psychology because creativity is the most direct expression of authentic selfhood. When your creative work is rejected, it can feel like your very soul is being dismissed. But Jung discovered something profound about creative rejection. It often serves as a refining fire that strengthens your authentic creative voice while teaching you to distinguish between creating for external validation and creating for authentic expression. Creative rejection is different from other forms of rejection because creativity is inherently personal. When an employer rejects your application, they're making a practical decision about job fit. When someone rejects your romantic advances, they're responding to compatibility factors. But when someone rejects your creative work, they're responding to the most vulnerable expression of who you are. This makes creative rejection both more painful and more potentially transformative than other forms of rejection.